just like if someone was navigating a ship, there's changes in directions, there's things that happen in life. This happened, now what?
Even when I was down there in the U.S., I thought I was fitting in fine, but turns out nope. Turns out everyone knew that I had a Canadian accent because
Oh, yeah.
it's weird for Canadians because we our ears are trained for American accents. So, but we have our own pronunciation for a lot of things anyway. So when we're talking to an American, we kind of feel like we're fitting right in. But if you ask an American, they'll be like, "No, I knew you're Canadian."
It's still slight though, but yeah, you can tell.
Yeah, it's a work in progress, but so yeah, I figured. So you sent me a couple articles there last night, and I would actually like to just start with maybe just reading, if you'd let me, the last two paragraphs of one of these articles, and then I'll have you reflect on it a little bit. And I'm sorry, but I do got to say, you write great articles, man. You really do. Like I was reading this thing this morning, and it's like, man, like you write really, really well. So I'm gonna start with this here, and then we'll see where it goes. We all have unled lives. There will always be forks in our path. For this reason, we need clarity. We must determine what truly matters and what doesn't. In an interview towards the end of his life, Christopher Hitchens remarked, quote, "One is always going to regret something. You have to decide in advance what it will be. Who are you? Who are you not? We must all choose what our unled lives will be. The art of leading a life is about deliberately choosing the type of life we want to lead." To quote Kierkegaard a final time, quote, "Life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward." So that's the ending of one of your recent articles on Substack. And what does that mean to you? I mean, apart from basically me just quoting you, if I could ask you to reflect on that.
Yeah, it's something I've been kicking around for, I think, a while. Just the idea of leading a life and what that is. I think most people have heard the Thoreau quote of, the mass of people live lives in quiet desperation. It's like, what's the opposite of that? The idea of leading a life. What's required? What are the obstacles? And I think one thing around the idea of unled lives, which maybe most famously the poet Robert Frost talks about in The Road Not Taken, of two roads diverged essentially, and he says, I'm sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. And that's true. I think it's important, but I also think it is more common than we realize. I mean, if we just take this conversation, this time that we're going to spend together, we made a choice to do so, happy to do so. And that means we've also said no to doing some other things, at least during this time. You simply cannot, travel two paths simultaneously. And I think that's what Kierkegaard talks about that I find interesting around regret. He says something along the lines of, no matter what you choose, It doesn't really matter. You're going to regret it either way. Now, whether that is true all the time, I'm not exactly sure, but I do think that that path that we didn't embark on can sometimes leave us asking some what if type of questions to contemplate, should I have done that? Should I have done this? It's just like to live is an infinite number of choices.
Yeah, for sure. This is a really interesting topic for me because I often think my perspective on that, on the past, is that it's the past. I don't spend too much time thinking back on what if. Part of the reason because, well, it's in some sense, unless you're going to use it to guide your future, it can be kind of a useless practice. And that might sound a little bit harsh, but I think a lot of times we arrive somewhere in life. You see this a lot in with people maybe in their 30s, maybe that midlife crisis thing where they do reflect on the past and they look back and they say, okay, well, what if I would have studied something a little different? What if I would have taken this job? What if I would have said yes? What if I would have said no? Would my life be better now? And I think that perspective misses that on that road, you've gained a perspective that you wouldn't have if you would have taken that other road. And so, I often think I have kind of two main big passions in my life when I was younger, really, sort of like the engineering side. I had a fork in the road for me, which was, do I go into something physical based like kinesiology, or do I do engineering? And I chose engineering, but part of me thinks back sometimes and said, maybe I should have done the other thing. But then I realized that, well, if I would have done kinesiology, I might have been sitting here thinking maybe I should have done engineering. So I don't know. Do you think this is like a useful thing to consider, or do you find yourself maybe thinking about this stuff?
I do think it's useful in the way of consciously and deliberately trying to choose and create the type of life that you want to lead. But I think it's important when it comes to looking back at the past, something that always stuck with me, some book about, great teams, sports teams, etc., whatever it may be. When it comes to looking back at the past, they definitely do so, but maybe 10% of the time is spent looking back at the past, and then 90% is looking forward or right there in the present moment, basically getting after it. And like as the Kierkegaard quote talks about, yeah, you can understand it backwards, but let's remember you've got to live forward. So at the end of this conversation, you do an interview on this podcast, you're naturally probably going to reflect, was that a good use of time? Do I want to potentially connect with this person again and maybe have them on again? Was it useful, unuseful? And then hopefully you can press on. If you would sit there and ruminate and stew, like, oh, I should have never had that person on. And I mean, you could do that with any particular task it is, just reflect. And I think it connects with what Dostoevsky is talking about of knowing the source of unhappiness. Was that useful? Not useful? Is that something I can do less of? Or the other way, do more of? But a quick reflection, almost in the idea of instead of, you hear Seneca just banging on about wandering. It's like pick a port, know where you're going. And like to me, that might be what Thoreau is talking about of, just living lives of just quiet desperation. You think of a ship out in the ocean that is just subject to the waves and the current. There's no sort of direction or piloting that ship. Is kind of how it connects with me a little bit. Just having some sort of clarity of what matters. And then once you might determine what matters, spending a life trying to integrate, what truly matters to you into daily life to the best of your ability.
Yeah, so you're looking at it more from the perspective of gaining wisdom to dictate where you're going in the future, and also probably to know yourself a bit better as well.
And for a philosophy of life. Like, if you think
Yeah.
of any philosophy of life, this idea of how we see the world, how we live in the way of virtues or principles, and the practices that we adopt, I've heard it said, and I totally agree with the idea that we all have a philosophy of life. Some are coherent, not coherent, helpful, harmful, but we all do have a philosophy of life. And sometimes, in the way of leading a life, it's about being deliberate in choosing your particular philosophy of life that you want to actually follow.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Everyone has a philosophy of life. And if you can't define it, which, let's be fair, I don't think most people can, you can certainly look at what you're acting upon, because you can only do one thing at each present moment. And so you have to decide at every point in time, what is the most important thing for me to do right now? And that's not going to be the same thing all day, every day. It's going to change. But that's why this idea of like this hierarchy of values, what's important to me, it's a very complicated endeavor. I'm going to throw something at you because this actually resonates with something that I've been thinking about yesterday. I was thinking how when you for you to be successful in anything, you really have to kind of just deal with the monotonous of life quite a bit, right? Like if you want to do well at your job, you probably have to show up on time every day, at least most of the time. You have, if you're in the office, you got to check your emails. Every job has this like list of like monotonous things that you kind of have to do over and over and over and over again. A lot of times they're boring. A lot of times you don't want to do them probably because they're boring. So in the present moment, a lot of the meaningful things that we do, if you consider success, which I would say uh, you can define success however you want it, but how I would define it is improving your character, right, in the Stoic sense, but also succeeding along those lines as well. So you don't just improve your character. You normally, for example, this podcast, and then I know you have your podcast. It's all pointed towards a goal, and in achieving that, you develop your character, but you're also achieving something else. But a lot of times that maybe the nitty gritty, when you're really getting into the details of things, when you're grinding, when you're doing those monotonous things that a lot of times you don't want to do, it's not it's not like a pleasant feeling. And so it can be very misleading for you to check in with yourself at every moment in time. It's like, okay, how am I feeling right now? It's like, okay, well, maybe I'm a little sad or maybe I'm a little happy. That can be very misleading because that's only a very like one little moment in time. So where I'm going with this is that's misleading, but what can be beneficial is actually looking back on the past. So you might ask yourself, am I living a meaningful life right now? And that's a really hard question to answer. It's really hard, especially if you're because you might change that answer at every moment in time. But if you ask yourself, am I happy with the decisions with am I happy with the life that I've lived so far? What has worked out well? What has not worked out well? What would I have done again had I was I if I was given the choice? And that question can be very powerful because it takes you out of let's say the the moment that you are in right now, and rather reflects back on something that you can have an objective, unemotional view on. What do you think of that?
You said a few things there. For the one thing on the monotony, the mundane tasks, I mean, to a certain extent, when it comes to your philosophy of life, what are your views and beliefs about that? You think of the dichotomy of control, what's up to us? There are many things, like many of the things that you're talking about, are just not up to you. So if you don't have that as part of your philosophy of life and you're clinging and trying to change things that are outside of your control, now that's suffering. So that's, to me, part of leading the type of life that you want to live. It's about having that philosophy of life that makes sense with how the world works. Like if there's somebody that's captaining a ship out in the ocean, and is just like all upset about the waves and the weather, that type of stuff, there's certain things that are just outside of your control. It's not necessarily helpful to worry about that. So I guess that's a little bit there, kind of common sense, but also much more difficult to do on a consistent basis, something we have to remind ourselves of. But when it comes to, I don't know, am I living a meaningful life? Some of these questions of reflecting and looking back on the past, to a certain extent, I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit different, but I don't necessarily see that as even super helpful or of a lot of interest to me. Maybe it is helpful, but some of these existentialists talk about basically just constantly creating. You're constantly creating a life. I think Kierkegaard says basically like every moment you're just creating a life. So there's not, I mean, who really knows? But I think of I'm pretty practical. I think in terms of the meaning. I mean, it's just up to you. It's like a personal preference type of thing. It all depends how you look at it. There's no sort of thing of where, okay, this is. It's completely up to you, in this moment. And I think, sorry to ramble here, but I think it's also the idea of you can constantly choose a new path. Like I'm leading this life, like I'm driving this thing. So if this doesn't work for me, I can make a change. Like if you don't want to show up at work at 8 in the morning and go do whatever, you can make a change to that. You can also be happy and do that. So I don't want to say you necessarily need to change that in order to find meaning and happiness. But again, you can make a change to that. And that is, I think, also part of the thing is like to live is to choose. It's an infinite number of choices and choosing new paths or staying on a particular path. Um, and I think it's important to realize that and have extreme agency in a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, you definitely have agency to change your path and where you want to go. But I think, yeah, have you seen The Office by chance?
Yeah,
I think we might have talked about this
big
personally, but
big fan.
yeah, me too. But there's a scene there where Andy, he reflects on, he says something like, "I wish there was a way to know you were in the good times while they were happening."
Mm.
And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. It's like in the moment, you're bombarded with good, bad, and ugly, right? Picture like a friendship that you had growing up. You think back, you'll think back fondly, but if you think back accurately, you're going to remember that you guys were fighting all the time. That you had some really great moments, and there were some joyful moments, probably a lot of joyful moments, and all that stuff. But there was also some bad in there too, and there's some scraped knees from falling off the bicycles. Like there's good, bad, and ugly. And when you're in that moment, you're experiencing the good, the bad, and the ugly. But when you look back on it, you see it through like a completely different lens. You see it as like, no, those were the good old days. And I just think I don't know. It's not something I do a lot. I don't reflect on the past a lot, but it's almost like Marcus Aurelius' question, like if you were to leave life right now, like what would you do or how would you act? And for me, I think, well, yeah, how would I act? But also, how would I feel about everything I've done so far? Because at some point in your life, near the end of it, you're going to have to ask that question. I think you're not going to have to ask it. I think it's going to come to you. Like, did I live a good life? And this ties in really well with what you're talking about with regret. And so maybe we can dig into that a bit more. But it does seem to be a question that you're going to have to face at some point in your life. And maybe it's good to have checkups in between.
Yeah. When it comes to the good times, bad times, to a certain extent, and this is where it comes into play of the philosophy of life, how, what your views and beliefs are, how do you see things? I get that to a certain extent, but I don't quite see it that way in terms of, because it's like, who's to say, good time, bad time, it could be from the perspective of, if we're breathing, you know, like maybe that is a good time. And, maybe it's just time is just time. But this idea of almost, I sometimes think of, it's like beyond gratitude. It was like whether you can be having it, just being, grateful, if you will, for each and every moment. Maybe that's what Nietzsche's talking about, amor fati. And maybe it's not realistic. I've, read how some people talk where it's not realistic. But I don't know, maybe it is. Maybe that is at least a perspective or a choice. Nietzsche talks about, I want to be a yes sayer. I want to say yes to life. That's not based on this. Well, it depends of all of this. If I have power, if the weather is this, or, all of these things, where we can adopt some sort of approach and think about, like, suffering, for example, or hardship or difficult. It's not necessarily good or bad. That's just our own. And I mean, it gets a little strange, but I think it connects in the way of regret. So the idea of choosing your regrets, just like we were saying, you can't embark on two paths. I'll talk about an example. I'm very fortunate to be retired from the military. Um, not a lot of expenses. I'm able to spend a tremendous amount of time with my kids. I drive them to school every morning. I pick them up. But by doing that, I'm also don't have some sort of job with all sorts of responsibilities and things like that. So it's like, you could depend. And I mean, lots of people in my situation, that I know that are retired, they're also like continuing to work these demanding jobs that have a lot of hours. And it depends. I mean, if you look at it from this perspective, and I think this has helped me at least make a decision of choosing your regrets in advance. I don't want to have the regret that I didn't, spend the time that I wanted to with my kids. And that's different for everybody. Like, somebody has to reflect and think about it that way. Can't do everything. You got to really think and contemplate, determine what matters to you, and then hopefully, if you're able, to the best of your ability, make that decision and chart out on that particular course. So if Seneca's talking about pick a port, like, maybe we have different ports, different directions for different domains of our life. And maybe it's all one thing, but it's in the way of getting clarity about, like, for you, I'm sure you have a certain fitness and strength training type of goals. You have a direction in that particular domain of your life, and then there's other domains, podcasts, work, etc., family, have a different level of clarity, a different port, if you will, that we're heading to.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely the case that, I mean, there's an infinite number of ways you could potentially go. I think the first time I really realized that, just how short life is and how you can't do everything, is with books. So
Yeah.
here comes the nerdy stuff. But I remember this was just like last year. I was looking up, like, the top books in this category and that category, top 100 books that you should read, top fiction books. I was like just trying to explore the full array of reading material. And I just had I started making this list, right? Like a stupid engineer, just making this Excel spreadsheet of this reading list, right? Full confession here. But I realized while I was making that, because I was doing the math in my head, like, okay, it's going to take me this amount of hours to read this many pages. It's like, there's no goddamn way I can finish all this. Not this year, not next year, in my life. Like I could live for
Yeah.
100 years and I can't read all these books. And then I think about the books I want to read again. You know, the Gulag Archipelago, these books, and Viktor Frankl's book, like these books that it's a sin to not read more than 3 times. And I just had that very profound moment that you were talking about there, where you realize that you do kind of have to be okay with the fact that you're not going to have time to do everything in life. And yeah, so I see what you're saying there. I don't know if it's a helpful perspective to have, though, going forward. I think it's one of those things that it's a truth, but I'm not sure if it's a useful truth. I think certainly the Stoic frame of reference would be to move forward and really to have no regrets, to see every stage in the past as either making your character better or worse. And maybe if it makes it worse, that's not such a good thing, but rather to view the whole spiritual experience as the development of your character, and that the externals around that don't necessarily matter so much. So just a very quick example to say what I mean about that. You mentioned fitness. So I'm in Olympic weightlifting, and I often think about, because I used to be a powerlifter, maybe if I would have kept powerlifting, I'd be a bit further now, and I wouldn't be as, I'd be a bit further in terms of my level of expertise with it. But I don't know. It's one of those questions. For me, it doesn't really matter, because either way, I'm developing my character. So maybe the external thing, I'd be better at it, I'd be more skilled at it. But if my focus is on virtue, I'm still being consistent. I'm still being disciplined. I'm still getting stronger. I'm still doing the thing that I have to do when I don't want to do it. I'm still gaining the sort of character from it, no matter what the external is. And so the external, the event, the thing that you choose to do, is actually more of a medium for learning, as opposed to an actual thing of value in and of itself. Does that make sense at all?
Not not quite. Like, I understand what you're saying, but I don't connect it necessarily with that. Like, as you were talking about, it's a truth. It's about seeing clearly. To stay with the example of the books, you have a stack of books from the floor to the ceiling. It's about a truth that there's an infinite number of books, good books, that you will not be able to read in your lifetime. Almost like a memento mori type of thing. When you think about these practices, memento mori, journaling, view from above, it is about seeing clearly, seeing that truth, the reality, sometimes harsh. I don't necessarily think this is harsh, but it's the fact of the matter. You know, I just started a book last night, The Meaning of Anxiety. Really enjoying it, but I had to think about, because I'm aware of just like what you're talking about. There's infinite number of books. I had to think about it. Is this the book that I want to start? Because I'm starting this. That means I'm saying no to half a dozen other books that I want to pick up and start reading. That's just a truth, and I think that connects with virtue. When we're seeing clearly, when we're seeing with reason, making a wise decision, discernment, choosing our particular path wisely, I think that only helps. You're getting into a little bit of the ruminating and maybe reflecting about a different particular path, like whether it's powerlifting. I don't necessarily think about it like that. If it is, I mean, it's a touch and go. Like, for the example of, you get done with this interview, you hit stop record. Hey, was that useful? Is this somebody I want to, connect with again? And then you're moving on. You just reflected for a second, and then you're continuing to navigate. Definitely not suggesting any sort of rumination on those unled lives or those paths you didn't embark on, but just keeping it aware, at the forefront that I have agency to choose. I am, called to choose and lead my life. And I'm faced with these infinite number of choices. And to make a wise decision, you have to know what matters, where you're headed, what's important to you, and have some clarity over just being tossed about in the waves, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets down to your values as what you choose to adopt. So the book example, it's such a great one. So I'll go back
Yeah.
to that. If you have an infinite number of books, not literally, but you have an infinite number of books that you could potentially read. But you and I, as let's say seekers of wisdom, we're gonna basically eliminate a lot of that stuff, like romance novels. I don't want to read any of that. A lot of the real deep scientific books, like in university, a lot of those stuff. Like maybe we'd read like a paperback version that's massively produced for dumb people, but like me. But there's if you take all of the books that we could potentially read, a lot of those are just going to fall off the map. But the reason they fall off the map is because you and I value something, wisdom and virtue, and we want to know how to live a better life. And so what you're getting down to, I think and I love this. I love this discussion because it's so interesting to me. But that's really what it gets down to. I think that at each present moment, you're talking about sort of reflecting on the fact that, is this aligned with my values? Is this helpful? And you can only ask, is what I am doing helpful, or is what I have just done helpful? You can only really answer that question if you know what you're aiming at. And the podcast guest example is another great one. You finish an episode interviewing a guest, and then you have to ask yourself, well, would I have that guy on again? Or would I have that girl on again? Well, let me see. What are my goals with the podcast? What are my values? I'm seeking wisdom. I want to share knowledge. I want to create community. I want to connect people. Did that conversation do that for people? And if it did, then it's aligned with your values. And then you know that you're sort of, at least that step was one step on the right road. If not, you might want to say, okay, maybe I won't even release that podcast episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, two great examples there. But yeah, no, I definitely concur on all that.
And let me bring up a point of something I've thought about as well, because you're highlighting the fact of having some clarity around your values. And I've talked about journaling, like the practice of philosophical journaling. If you don't have a set of principles, like the cardinal virtues, for example, that might be guiding your life, what are you reflecting on? How can you even particularly do this practice? It's just like what you're saying. If you reflect on that podcast guest, if you don't have some clarity around what you're trying to maybe do, what you're curious about, the reflection is like, I'm not sure you could even really call it useful or a good use of time. There has to be some sort of measure, some sort of concreteness to it, if that's a word. Because again, it's the same thing of yeah, I think that's just an interesting point. And I also think in terms of clarity, like when it comes to the cardinal virtues, for example, courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice, like what do those mean to you? What does that look like in your life? You have to have a bit of clarity on that as well, to then quickly, as Seneca talks about, quickly review his day. If you're reviewing your day, there has to be some sort of clarity there.
Yeah, and maybe the best word here is alignment.
Yeah,
Alignment between your values and your actions, but you have to know what your damn values are. And it kind of when you were speaking there, it reminded me of that quote from Seneca, that something like life is life is not short. It's just that we waste most of it. And that's an
exactly.
interesting idea, right? Because you might ask yourself, well, what does it mean to waste life? And wasted life take away everything in philosophy that we understand. Basically, what it would be is a waste of life is one that is not lived with alignment between your values and your actions. So for Seneca, a wasted life is one that's not guided by wisdom, not seeking virtue, not working on your character. But for some people that have, let's say, a value of reading romance novels, they would never look back at their years of reading romance novels and say, "Oh, I've wasted my life." They have a completely different frame of reference, and again, it really does sort of highlight that you really do need to know what you value and where you're going, because if you don't know where you're going, no wind is favorable. That
Yeah.
quote, another quote that I just butchered. But yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I want to circle back to something here that you said about suffering being a privilege, because that's actually something that I've been working on lately, and so I'd like to bounce some stuff off you there. It's an interesting thing because suffering is, you could say, pain, right? But it's a part of the experience of life, and it's inevitable. You're going to suffer. Life is suffering, if you ask the Buddha. And there's this lyric rather, and the guy's talking about this very fact that if you're lucky in life, you're going to get your heart broken. Right? He has that line in that, and it's in the chorus, so it's a really reoccurring theme in that song, that it's a lucky thing to have your heart broken. It's a good thing to be able to get up in the morning at 6 a.m. and suffer. And it's a very difficult thing to wrap your head around, because you might ask, well, how the hell can I suffer and enjoy it and find meaning in it? But I think we do it all the time. I mean, I do it in the gym every day. I do it in the morning. I get up, and if you flip your perspective, you know, your alarm goes off and you think, holy shit, like I got to get up. I'm tired. I didn't sleep well last night. But then you change your perspective and you say, well, I'm waking up. So this is suffering, but the alternative is not existing. So the alternative is far much worse in this particular case. I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, do you think you can actually enjoy suffering? It's a really, I mean, if you can, it's like Dostoevsky. If you can enjoy a toothache, like you're pretty spiritually free.
Yeah. And I'm not sure. I didn't. If I did say that suffering is a privilege, I don't necessarily mean it that way. I mean that suffering is not necessarily good or bad. Well, let's table like the extreme darkness, the evil of the evil. I'm saying like the suffering that we would often label as something as this is bad. And we were talking earlier about good and bad and this is that. It's not necessarily that. I mean, the Stoics are really banging on about that. Well, it's not necessarily that this is good or bad. You have labeled it that. It doesn't necessarily mean that. And in many of these other wisdom traditions, that same thing comes up. That is your perspective, but it doesn't necessarily, like, if you lined up 100 people, the perspectives of that might be a totally different range. There'd be many, many different ways to look at these things. Some might label something as neutral, some as good. I mean, it's just across the board, but it's our individual perspective that we're necessarily viewing it that way. And like Seneca talks about, as you quoted there, you know, he says the fool's life is empty of gratitude and full of fears. Like, let's take the example that you mentioned of, I don't want my heart broken. There's many people that would necessarily say that who have never had their heart broken. So they really don't necessarily know what it feels like to have your heart broken. And I'm not saying that that is not, you know, a pleasurable thing, but it is interesting that we can say that we don't want something to happen, that has literally, we've never experienced it. We don't exactly know. That heartbreak, the ending of one relationship could be the greatest thing ever. It could birth a whole new path, an actually, beautiful relationship. I mean, we just don't know. And I think some of this stuff connects back with, this idea we're not fortune tellers. There's no crystal ball to gaze in. And when Seneca is talking about these fears, that's a fear. Seneca, Montaigne, many others of, I've had all these terrible misfortunes and all these fears that really never happened. So you could be in a relationship and clinging and worried about a particular heartbreak that literally just never happens. And that's something we have to remember, that fear. And when you look at to back to the beginning quote though from Thoreau, most people live lives of quiet desperation. If you look at synonyms of desperation, it's really about living a life of fear, of worry, of despair, being distracted. There's these many synonyms of desperation. And it's sometimes maybe of just not knowing. And if that thing of good and bad, of suffering, and again, sorry for another rambling response here, but we just don't know necessarily that everything is good or bad. Sometimes things are just, it just is. And if we can see it clearly, and maybe take away some of the delusion, we can make wiser decisions and respond with wisdom.
Mm-hmm. That line, man, that quote from Thoreau, leading quiet desperation. Every time I hear that, my heart just sinks.
Yeah.
Like, it's just one of those quotes that always just destroys me. And to mention the heartbreak thing, what's important to recognize here, though, and it gets back to your point on recognizing that you have agency, is that you can go through a breakup, and people do, and you can spend the rest of your life looking back on that and thinking, I had one chance at love, I had one chance to live a great life and have children and have the perfect, and I messed it up. And people do that. A lot of people, it's rare to, I mean, there are people that do that for their whole lives, but there's certainly people that do that more commonly for like years after a breakup. And then at the same time, you can look back and you can say, well, actually, it kind of worked out for the best, didn't it? Because now I have a better relationship, or now I know myself better, or whatever. And if you think about the differences, it's not just one of perspective on that account. If you have person A and person B, it's not that they're just having a different perspective on it. It's also the actions that they've chosen to do following that. So if you go through a breakup, you get your heart broken, you do what's necessary to heal from that. You try and let go of resentment, you try and let go of bitterness and get rid of that baggage. You try and journal to work out these issues, and then you approach love with a new energy, and one that's not dragged down by your past experience. Yeah, guess what? You are going to look back in a year or two and say, that worked out for the best. But you could also do the opposite. You can have your heart broken and you can say, well, that was my one chance. You can fall right into resentment, which is far more easier than people give it credit for. And basically, yeah, if you do that, you're going to look back and say, man, that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. So as important as it is, and this just really ties in with what you were talking about, like maximizing your agency with this stuff. It's like, yes, you do have the choice. And depending on how you look back on things, it really does matter how you deal with it at this present moment. Because at every present moment, it's falling back into the past. So if you choose to act virtuously in each and every moment, you end up looking back on your life with a bit more of just a better perspective, one that's more helpful, one that you're more proud of.
Yeah, hopefully a wiser perspective. In some of these things, to stay with the relationship thing, Yeah, maybe one person makes a lot of unwise decisions. Maybe they're unfaithful, whatever it may be, and that relationship ends. Like that happened, and they have responsibility for that. But what is the wisest decision if you're leading your life moving forward? If you're navigating, in each and every moment and moving forward and hopefully continually attempting to wisely create the type of life that you want to lead, it's like that happened. Say it's the other way. That relationship ends, the love of your life, and they were unfaithful, whatever it may be. Yes, that happened. But now you have the agency, but again, you also have the responsibility to lead your life moving forward. That happened. And, it doesn't mean we don't necessarily look in the rearview mirror. And that's what I think is so difficult sometimes when it comes to wisdom. Seneca, I've used the example like Seneca will talk about, hey, at the end of your day, you look back, you review your day. But then he's also talking about living in the moment, charting your course. It's this and it's that. Yes, you're looking in the rearview mirror, but yes, you're moving forward. There's so many of these things. And that's why wisdom, it's just nothing is so clear cut. Like Marcus Aurelius talks about going through obstacles. Elsewhere in Meditations, he's talking about going around obstacles. You just never really know, but you just make the best decision you can in that moment and you chart your course going forward as wise as you possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think what allows you to do that is something like faith. It is something like faith, which is, yeah, you know what? Despite that, things can still get better for me. Or even more stoically, you could say that probably happened for a reason. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But if you have that perspective from the get go, it really can make a difference in terms of really where you go. Um, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and then sometimes it just happened. Period.
Yeah.
Now what? These existentialists, Kierkegaard and many others, it's kind of strange. They get really deep into the topic of anxiety in navigating your life, and they talk about this thing of normal anxiety. You have to navigate it. You think of that particular person with the fork in the road. They've got to choose a particular path and then just press forward. They have to navigate through the anxiety. And some of the things we've talked about are of maybe the person that is ruminating on the past, or getting feeling a bit like a victim, or labeling themselves in a particular way. We can get to these points of where we want to avoid the anxiety. It's like we don't want those particularly negative feelings, and we're labeling things as this is good, this is bad. And Kierkegaard talks about, that's how you lose yourself. You know, to venture down a particular path is to essentially navigate anxiety. But failure to do so is to completely just lose yourself. And that's where I think you get into this, that life of quiet desperation, that life of, we're living in worry, despair. And that's part of being human, but it's also in the way of leading a life. If we think about this perspective of agency and responsibility, we're navigating through this. And some of these people, like Kierkegaard, talks about anxiety as being a teacher.
It does beg the question, though, that because, well, I think one of the points that I think you were making earlier is that suffering, it's not, you can label it good or bad depending on your perspective on it. But my take on this whole thing would be, in the present moment, you're dealing with good, bad, and ugly, or ugly, right? At the present moment, if you want to get right down to the details, you can only experience one of them. But then if you're living meaningfully, let's say if you're living aligned with your goals, you're going to have those good, bad, ugly moments anyway, right? And then as you move forward in life, that's falling back into the past. And when you're looking back on that, when you look back on it as the good old days, as Andy would say from The Office, that's sort of probably the best measure you have on whether or not you're leading a good life. And so it is important to reflect, as we've been talking about the whole episode here. I did want to, maybe we can explain that, which is going to tear me up a bit, but let's do it. Quiet desperation. I'm going to try and explain what I think that feels like. And I think we've all glimpsed little pieces of this in our lives. And that's why I think for a lot of people that idea can hit really hard, because they know what it's like. It's something like you wake up in the morning and you don't want to wake up. You don't want to get up. Not because you're tired, not because the dog was up all night and you couldn't sleep, because you do not like what you have to do next. But you also know that you got bills lining up. You have to go pay that. You also know that your partner is with you and they're depending on you. Maybe you have some kids and you have to support them as well. So you find a way to kind of drag yourself into bed. The whole drive to work is just a mess because you're anxious about what you have to deal with there. You don't like the people involved. You feel small. You feel like it's just going to be another 8 days of hell, of quiet desperation. You go to the job. It's not meaningful. You sit there for 8 hours. You have the same thing on the way back. And then underlying all of this is sort of that question of like, can I change this? And for a lot of people, unfortunately, they think no. A lot of people think, no, I can't go get another job. Like, what the hell am I going to do? This is sort of what I have now, and I have all these responsibilities. I have people depending on me. So that's sort of like a general day that I would think that is in quiet desperation, but that is, it's full of what you mentioned earlier, which is anxiety. It's fear. And it's just deep meaninglessness. And I don't know, what does that resonate? Would you add anything to that?
Well, I think it's complicated when it comes to what to do about that. And when it comes to, does the person have control over many of these things? Possibly not. But I think an important thing, at least for me, it comes back to the beginning, as you were talking there, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't necessarily view it as that good, bad, ugly thing. Sometimes it just is. It's a matter of perspective. And who's to say that your perspective is accurate? To use the example of The Office, the good old days, some sort of fond memories. And I would say not that our memories are actually accurate, but something that could be quote unquote labeled as bad. And I even feel uncomfortable even saying that, because it's like, who's to say what it is? It's a bit almost crystal ball gazing, even the present moment of we're labeling it. And when we look at some of these wise thinkers, people that I think is wise, like to stay with maybe Stoics, for example, between stimulus and response is judgment, are basically perspective. Seneca talks about in On Anger. It's a judgment whether something is good, bad, ugly, and indifferent. So you could have one person that is, the alarm is going off early, and there is this thing of, these things that we have to particularly do. But you might have a neighbor right next door who has the same particularly job, going to the same place, and views it in a 180-degree difference, wakes up with a smile on their face, and they look at it as an opportunity. So it's like, how do we make sense of that? I think that's an important thing to detach when it comes to our perspective. If we want to label something in our lives as good, bad, ugly, whatever it may be, to just hold that a bit loosely and say, as Montaigne talked about, what do I know? Who's to say how I'm going to think about this 10 years from now? Is this the wisest perspective to take? Is this working? Is this helpful? As Seneca talked about, I mentioned earlier the quote, "The fool's life is empty of gratitude." Am I viewing this empty of gratitude? What does this look like with gratitude integrated into it? Maybe read Marcus Aurelius's Meditation on Getting Out of Bed. You could use that rationale of how he wrestled with getting out of bed with any particular task. And I think he was as well. He's, wrestling with, just this particular thing. But I think that gives an insight into his perspective of, what's your duty and obligation as a human being? And that's what he's doing. I mean, it's a long reflection, if you will, on duty and obligation and how do you fit in, and something we haven't talked about around that philosophy of life of how do you see the world, these perspectives. And most people are familiar, especially with your show, of cardinal virtues, but we don't often have very fresh in our mind the wise perspectives of viewing the world, like in the way of impermanence, interconnectedness, a beginner's mind, or simply, not knowing, being more open and curious, if you will. These are some wise perspectives that across every wisdom tradition, those things exist. Those three that I listed: impermanence, interconnectedness, and a beginner's mind, if you will, or humility. You could maybe call it many different things. And that's where it comes to be. When it comes to, if we're seeing something, this person that is, living in a bit of desperation, they're almost viewing it, to me, as a victim of the world, as a victim of someone that is just being rocked about in this stormy ocean of water. And maybe that is true. Yes, there are rough waves. There are many things that are outside of our control. But viewing it from the perspective of agency and responsibility, this is now what? Now what? How do I want to navigate these, endless choices and options that I have?
Yes, very well said. Very beautiful. I think I found one of the. I think I found one of the things that we've been thinking about differently here, because I'm in full agreement with everything you said. When you look back on, for example, getting out of bed in the morning, you could look back on it and say, well, that's bad because I don't want to get up in the morning and I'm
Yeah.
tired, and or you could look back and say, no, it's a good thing, and I get up and I go to work, and this was my fault. When I'm talking about the past as good, bad, or ugly, I'm referring to something more like the how pleasant it is. So when you wake in the morning, even Marcus Aurelius would agree that it's unpleasant when the alarm. Well, he didn't have an alarm; maybe he had a rooster go off. But when he has to get up in the morning early, it's not pleasant. Just like lifting a weight, it's not really pleasant. But that doesn't mean it's good or bad. And so, I've probably been using these terms wrong, because you're absolutely right. And this is what's so powerful about the Stoic mindset, is that you look back in your life, and if you've used those experiences to improve your character, that makes it good. If you've used those experiences to make your character worse, that is bad. But if you look back on all those experiences, the experience that improves your character can be one that is pleasant, or it can be one that's unpleasant. If you dedicate yourself to get up at the same time every morning to go to work, that's not going to be pleasant most of the time. It's not going to be pleasant,
Yeah.
but it's going to be good because you're developing discipline over time and obviously contributing positively to the world and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
And I love our conversations because we can have, we don't necessarily obviously need to be in agreement. And we've talked so much that we can kind of understand each other's perspectives and stuff. It's beautiful. The pleasant thing, I would say, it depends. There may be some mornings where someone feels that way and others where they do not. So it's not necessarily a
Right.
consistent thing, something that's pleasant and unpleasant. It's impermanent. It doesn't necessarily stay or last. Um, but then from a Buddhist perspective of life is suffering, if you translate that suffering, the, the word dukkha, it's not necessarily, a lot of people talk about it's not necessarily in the way of suffering how we might think. It's life is unpleasant, or basically things don't last. It's a bit of a, there's this analogy of a wheel. It's a bit of a rocky ride, if you will. But they also talk about, if it continues, is that there's a way beyond that. There is a path. And if you think of, I don't want to get out of bed, to stay with that example. Well, that's just a want. That's just a desire. Epictetus, the Buddha, and all these people, well, our path to peace, our path to tranquility is not by fulfilling our desires, it's by removal of desires. And then when we can recognize that, oh, this is just a want, then we can actually loosen our grip on it, it seems like, and let go of our desires, or at least become aware that it's a desire, that it's an indifferent. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely, man. No, completely agree with that. It is a lot of times we do get blinded by, we confuse what we want with what we need.
Yeah.
And that's really hard because what you want is it's a very powerful motivator in the moment. When you wake up at 6 a.m. and you're tired, your body is telling you you are tired, you need more sleep. Your mind is telling you you have to get up and go to work so you can contribute positively to the world. So it is really hard to quench that. And I think maybe there's a balance as well to kind of give in to some of the wants from time to time, which I think you kind of just have to do that. You have to kind of balance that. But really that's discipline. And discipline is one of the probably the most hardest thing to really, really master, I think, because you have to constantly say no to your wants and do instead what you need.
And I think it's it's the art, I guess, if you will, the art of leading a life. If one morning you're absolutely exhausted, it's good to be aware of that and acknowledge that and press on. And then guess what? Later that day, hopefully, if possible, go to bed earlier. Next, and you're moving on. So it's like you're navigating life. Just like if someone was navigating a ship, there's changes in directions, there's things that happen in life. This happened, now what? And I think if we have a coherent philosophy of life with clarity, perspectives, principles, and practices, alignment, we can navigate life. And it's, from one perspective, it's very difficult. But in another perspective, no, it's really not as difficult as one might think. Like if I came to you and I said, hey, I want to work with you. I want to deadlift this much. I want to squat this much. I want to bench press this much. I don't think you would think that it's unrealistic or unbelievably challenging. I think you would probably tell me, hey, with patience, with commitment, this is too easy. We got this. You might not be able to put an exact date on, hey, by this date, we're going to be here. But yeah, at some point in time, this is where you're at. We're going to make a lot of progress. And you might naturally come up with some sort of system, some sort of routine, and you might change it along the way, and we would come up with something. But we don't necessarily do that with life oftentimes. We can generally just live lives of quiet desperation. We can generally just kind of go with the flow of life and, meander our way around, or as Seneca talks about, just wandering our way around. We don't necessarily take the wheel as much as we probably can. I don't know. Does that connect with you? Would you think that is something as maybe fairly simple to increase, those three particular lifts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I had to sum up what you said there, you have to know how to adjust your sails.
Yeah.
This hits me so hard because I grew up on a fishing boat. If you're going somewhere, let's say you have some fishing nets out at this particular location, that's where you're going. So in other words, if you value virtue and the cardinal virtues, that's where you're going. You don't care which way the wind's blowing. You don't care which way the current's blowing. That's where you're going. Period. So if you're sailing to a particular location, that's where you want to go. You have your sails set up in a particular way to take maximum advantage of the wind, and the wind changes. You can imagine how ridiculous it would be for someone on the sailboat to go, oh, well, shit, I guess I'm going over there now. It's like, it's
Yeah.
ridiculous. Like, what are you talking about? No, just
Yeah.
adjust your sails. Now, if you don't know how to adjust the sails, guess what? You are going to end up somewhere you don't want to be. In the same way, when you have a value system and you have somewhere where you want to go, life's going to change the wind on you all the time, constantly. And you need to know how to react to it. And that example you gave, which is just so practical and it makes so much sense in light of this. I want to get up at 7 a.m. every morning. Okay, easy. I'm extra tired today because I didn't sleep well. Okay, the wind has changed. What do? I adjust my sails. I go to bed earlier tonight, just for tonight, so I can get extra sleep so that I can get back on my schedule tomorrow and get up at 7 a.m. again. You're constantly, throughout life, adjusting your sails, adjusting your rudder to try and account for the chaos that's coming in, which is all of the externals. In other words, you are focusing on what you can control because there's so much outside of your control. But if you know where you want to go, it doesn't matter. And as long as if you know where you want to go and you know how to adjust your sails given the external conditions.
Mhm. And I would just add one thing in addition to that, because some people may not necessarily know where they want to go, or they may not think of it that way. If you know how you want to live, and you're pressing on.
Yeah, I would even say, like, if you don't know where you want to go somewhere. If you have no idea where the fish are, don't just stand on the wharf and think about it. Go throw a net somewhere and see what happens.
Yeah.
And people do this, man. Young people do this all the time. They don't know what school they want to go to. They don't know what career they want to take on, and then they just, well, I'm gonna, I guess, just stay home with mom and dad until I can figure it out. It's like, no, go do something, anything. It doesn't matter, because if you hate it, you hate it, and you'll realize that you hate it. If you have a map of the ocean and you don't know where the fish are, but you say, I'm going to try this spot right here, and you find out there's no fish there, that's not useless. That's valuable information, because now you know there's no fish there and you can go somewhere else. So get moving. As Marcus Aurelius would say, get up and get moving.
Yeah, definitely. And it's and I think we can it's maybe easier than we realize to do so. It's not completely easy, but maybe it's easier than we realize to think about leading our life. And as so many of these wise people have talked about before, it's like no one can do it for us. It's we have to walk the path, and we know how to walk the path. And it's not going to be perfect. And there's like just like you said of you put some lines in the water, and if there's no bites, it's the same thing in the way of that fork in the road. If we take a particular path, and that's okay. We're going to meet another fork in the road, and we can take a different path. And it's just going to be an infinite number of choices. And these are just opportunities to make wiser choices, to make choices that are in alignment with the type of life that we want to lead.
Great spot to end there, man. Well said. Thanks again for another great conversation. You know how much I love and respect you. What are you doing, man? You're doing a lot. You're writing articles. You're doing this new perennial meditations. What are you up to? Where would you send people?
Well, I love it, man. I have a tremendous amount of respect for what you do. I'm a longtime listener and fan of the Strong Stoic. So just to be able to come on and chat and connect, I don't think there's an episode that I missed that you put out, and I think you're putting out a ton of wisdom in the world. What I enjoy these days, obviously, I do the In Search of Wisdom, which is weekly. Every Wednesday, I put out a conversation with someone you've been on many times and many different authors. I guess it's primarily a philosophy podcast, but explores many different wisdom traditions, but mostly with the Perennial Meditations. It's a daily newsletter. So it's on Substack. Perennial Meditations is the name of it, perennial.substack. But every morning when I get back from dropping off my kiddos at school, I'm putting out a short podcast or article that's usually less than 5 minutes, just about some of the things we've been talking about, things that I'm curious about myself and curious about for others. Maybe it's something that might be of use.
Definitely recommend it. Check it out. I'm sure all my audience know you by now, man. So,
Cool.
but
Thanks, man.
I wanted you to announce, kind of the newer stuff you're working on too, because you're hard at it, man. Talk about discipline. So, thanks again, buddy, and until next time.
Thank you, man.